Larry Dossey, Dr. Larry Dossey, is a medical doctor, and he got his undergraduate and graduate education down in Texas. We won't hold that against him at all, but after becoming a doctor, he went off and was a battalion surgeon with the Army in Vietnam. And so I remember, not very well, but some of our early conversations were around the whole Vietnam experience because I had been there as well. He ended up being the chief of medicine, or running a big part of a hospital for a while, and then he went out and started writing books and thinking about things outside of a kind of conventional medicine. And Larry has become, in addition to being a pretty good guy, he's become a real kind of on the forefront of kind of mining the fringy edge of the whole kind of essence of what the reality we live in that has this non-local kind of aspect to it, which is to say, how does prayer work, which is non-local, right? I think about it here, and that affects somebody out there. And he's approached this from a scientific point of view. He's not particularly woo-woo. I mean, he doesn't. He's a pretty solid citizen kind of guy, but he has really defined. He's had 16 books have you written, and Oprah Winfrey and New York Times and all those kinds of things, and hundreds of medical and other kind of published journal articles. He's a editor, and are you the publisher anyway of a peer-reviewed scientific journal right now. And he and I are friends because years ago in an organization called the Society for Scientific Exploration, we kind of hit it off. And this is a great scientific group where the scientists and the researchers who are out on the fringy edge were willing to think about the unconventional kind of stuff, kind of hang out. And they're serious operators. John McMichael, who was here in November, some of you may remember, was from the SSE. Hal Puthoff is from the SSE, and so it's generated a lot of wonderful kind of thinkers and so on. And so we're very happy to have you with us, Larry, and we appreciate your coming. And I'll hand off this little microphone to you.
Thank you, John. I must say that's one of the most interesting introductions I've ever had in my life. I have been dealing with bronchitis and pharyngitis and laryngitis. So those of you who do believe in healing energy, send me some, would you? We'll just turn this lecture into a little clinical experiment. Which reminds me, years ago in Dallas, where I practiced internal medicine for many years, I got a call one weekend to substitute for a woman who was giving a local keynote address at a university. And they said she's come down with some illness and she cannot give her talk, so would you substitute for her? And I said, well, I'd be happy to, but what was she going to talk about? And they said, well, her subject was how to have perfect health. So the universe has a way of humbling us occasionally. Well, I want to address the issue of consciousness and what it has to do with healing. And the first question I would like for you to entertain with me is what is it we mean when we use this term healing? What does it look like? Oh, this is what I was taught and what medical students are still taught healing has to do with. It has to do with the restoration of proper function through the wise use of medications, psychological and behavioral interventions, and also the use of surgical procedures. Now, in medical school, it is still the case that other things get left out. Occasionally, they have a way of sneaking back into the national and international medical dialogue, however, and this was made vivid to me back in 1991 when this showed up on the cover of the Journal of the American Medical Association. Here you have a scrubbed and gowned and gloved surgeon about to enter the surgery suite, and he has his hands folded in some sort of intercessory prayer. And I thought, well, why can't we talk about this? And as a matter of fact, it's been very difficult to do. My wife and I were giving a lecture about these issues in Tacoma, Washington a while back. And after our talk, a female surgeon came up and she said, when I'm gloved and gowned and scrubbed up and I'm about to enter the medical suite, the surgery suite, she says, I always raise my hands and here's my prayer. She said, Dear God, these are your hands. Now don't go and embarrass yourself. Actually, I consider this the perfect surgeon's prayer. I read a lot and I follow the literature in this field. And I want to recommend a book for you. This is written for lay people, and it's by Dr. Scott Kolbaba, who is a general internist in the Wheaton, Illinois area. The title of the book is Physicians' Untold Stories, and that pretty much says that one of the points I want to make is that there's a tremendous disincentive for physicians to go public with the things that I'm going to talk to you about. And I want to use one of the stories in this book, Physicians' Untold Stories, that makes this point. Dr. Kolbaba was an interesting guy. He went around and he asked his colleagues who were on the staff of this hospital, I'm going to do a book about things that you and I never talk about. So what I would like for you to do is contribute a chapter. And I want you to just to write down the most outrageous thing you have ever seen in your life as a doctor. And he got about 30 contributions, and I want to share one of them with you, which makes one of the central points of this talk. This has to do with a young woman, Barbara Comiskey, and if you look up Barbara Comiskey on Google, you'll find all sorts of information relating to this story. She was cared for by Dr. Thomas Marshall, an internist in the Wheaton area, and her story is very complicated, so I'm just going to go through this with the slides. She was a talented gymnast in high school, and she played the flute, and she was very popular, and everybody loved her. But unfortunately, at the age of 15, she began to develop symptoms of multiple sclerosis. This was an aggressive case of MS. She graduated high school in '68, and she entered college, but she couldn't compete because of the struggle. She had 2 respiratory arrests in the early 70s. That's not good. You quit breathing. She survived, however, and had several recurrent hospitalizations because of pneumonia. She experienced a collapsed lung in 1980. She had a tracheostomy with continual oxygen thereafter. She lost control of her bowel and bladder and had an indwelling catheter and an ileostomy. And she lost her vision, as many people with MS do because of brain involvement. She became legally blind, and although she had been religious, she lost her faith. She became bedbound with severe contractures. She was all pretzeled up in bed, couldn't stretch out. She was in a permanent fetal position. She couldn't swallow any longer. In order to keep her alive, she had a stomach feeding tube from the outside entering her stomach. And by 1981, nobody had any hope that she could survive all of this. And the doctor and the family got together and they decided that there would be no heroics when she died, and they would just simply let her go. Well, they lived in a little town. And there was a little radio station, WMBI, and they decided one Sunday that they would have a radio pray-in for people in the community who were seriously ill, and Barbara made the list. And we know that there was an enormous turnout because weeks later, the radio station was just flooded with bags and bags of letters attesting to the fact that people had indeed prayed for this group of people. Here's what happened. She had two girlfriends who had come over to sit with her this Sunday afternoon. And this was all witnessed and attested to by these two girlfriends. So Barbara said that she heard a man's voice saying, "My child, get up and walk." She did. Her interpretation was that God was speaking to her. And so here's what happened. She jumped out of bed, she removed her oxygen, and for the first time in several years, she stood upright on her own legs. Her vision came back. And she was no longer short of breath off of oxygen. And her mother heard some racket in the bedroom, came in, and apparently her body had begun to change. The mother looked at her and said, you have muscles again. Well, her father came in, and the two girlfriends said he hugged her and waltzed her around the room. And nobody could believe this in the family constellation. And this being a Sunday, they figured that maybe they ought to go back to church that night. And they did. So everybody in the community and the congregation knew about her and her horrible situation. And here they saw something they couldn't believe. Here she walks up the central aisle to the front of the church where the minister was, and frankly, he did not handle this well. Witnesses said he fell against the podium and he kept muttering, "This is nice. This is very nice." Well, everybody got over the shock and heard a little sermon and went back home. And the next day, the family took Barbara to see Dr. Marshall, her internist, who began to record all this stuff. And this is what he wrote. "I thought I was seeing an apparition. Here was my patient who was not expected to live another week, totally cured. I stopped all of her medication and took out her bladder catheter, but she wasn't quite ready to have the trach tube removed until another visit. No one had ever seen anything like this before." And he further wrote, "That afternoon we sent Barb for a chest x-ray. Her lungs were now perfectly normal with a collapsed lung totally expanded with no infiltrate or other abnormality that had existed before. I have never witnessed anything like this before or since." And in the write-up in the book, here's what he adds. "Barb has gone on to live a normal life in every way. She subsequently married a minister and feels her calling in life is to serve others." And if you want to have another insight into this case history, as I say, you can Google her name on the internet. You'll come up with all sorts of information. I've already used some terms that I think we ought to pause long enough to define, because if you don't define your terms, you know, we're not on the same page. Here's how that works. Here's, and this is the dumbest cartoon I own, I'll confess it to that. Here's a man who's drowning, and he says to his faithful dog on the shore, "Lassie, get help." Well, Lassie gets help. But the drowning man and Lassie were not on the same page about what help meant, so I want to pause long enough to define a few terms. This business of spirituality, I take it to be a sense of connectedness with something higher than the individual self or ego an absolute or immanent or transcendent power, whatever name you want to attribute to this entity. And it involves the conviction that meaning and value and direction and purpose are valid aspects of how the world works. This is not the same as religion. I take religion to be a codified system of belief and worship and conduct, and it may or may not involve a sense of the spiritual. And it usually takes place, does religion, in a group of like-minded believers. And one other term I'll be using in this talk is the term soul. And this is just the dictionary definition. The spiritual or immaterial part of a human being or animal that's regarded as eternal and immortal. Now, John has talked about transitions taking place in culture. Let me tell you that there is a huge transition afoot in medicine about the nature of consciousness. Now, there are a great many scholars and philosophers and scientists who are writing books about the nature of consciousness. There's one individual, I think, who stands above the rest in this endeavor. It's Jeffrey Kripal. He is a philosopher at Rice University. He's written several books you can look up. Here is his take on what consciousness is and the status of the debate about the nature of consciousness in medicine and science. Consciousness is the fundamental ground of all that we know or ever will know. It is the ground of all of the science, all of the arts, all of the social sciences, all of the humanities, indeed, all human knowledge and experience. He goes on to say, moreover, as far as we can tell at the moment, it is entirely sui generis. It is its own thing. It isn't manufactured. It's not the product of any other process. We know of nothing else like it in the universe, and all we know only in and through and because of this same consciousness. There are those who claim that consciousness is not its own thing, is reducible to warm, wet tissue and brainhood, but to this day, no one has ever come close to showing how this might work, probably because it doesn't. In other words, he's saying that you cannot get consciousness from brain tissue. It is fundamental in its own right. It is not derivative of anything else. And so I want to advance a premise to you that health and all forms of healing have got to include a vision of consciousness, some philosophy of what consciousness is, because consciousness enters into every discussion we have about the nature of life and death and the hereafter. So the question is, what is their vision of consciousness going to be? Well, I'll tell you the vision with which I was indoctrinated. And when you send your kids off to university or college and they enter the biological sciences, this is still pretty much the message that they come away with. Consciousness is perishable. There is no hereafter. And death is final. Because consciousness is produced by the brain, so it is said, so that when the brain dies, everything that you call yourself dies with it. There is nothing that survives. Now, I happen to think that this is one of the most morbid, negative visions of who we are and why we're here that has ever been concocted. And I believe, in my experience as a physician attending many dying people, that the fear of total annihilation with death has caused more suffering in human history than probably all the other physical diseases combined. Now, there are people who begin to philosophize about this fear and to say, well, that's just sort of overdone. We're taking this worry too far. One of these is Sogyal Rinpoche, who wrote the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. He says this, I don't know if this was intended as humor or not, but he says, not to worry, we will all die successfully, so don't sweat it. This sort of lighthearted attitude toward death has been around for a while. In the 16th century, the great French essayist Montaigne said this: "If you don't know how to die, don't worry. Nature will tell you what to do on the spot, fully and adequately. She will do the job perfectly for you, so don't bother your head about it." Well, people do bother their heads about it. I collect comments like this. Tom Ford, the famous contemporary fashion designer: "Death is all I think about. There's not a day or really an hour that goes by that I don't think about death." And I think he speaks for a lot of people. There was a book that won the Pulitzer Prize in 1974 called The Denial of Death. And Ernest Becker, who wrote this famous book, examined the ways in which our culture has of denying the inevitability of death. One of the people who became famous for making light of this was Woody Allen. Here's what Woody said: "I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve immortality through not dying. I don't want to live on in the hearts of my countrymen. I want to live on in my apartment." There's a famous, well, actually she's not so famous, she's been pretty much forgotten, but she wrote a lot of fiction in the British literary tradition, Susan Ertz. Millions long for immortality who don't know what to do with themselves on a rainy afternoon. And one of my favorite jazz performers is Albert King, the great jazz guitarist and singer. Everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. So I want to look at this business of immortality, eternality, and the soul. And the basic question: is there anything like the soul? And again, I take the soul to be the spiritual, immaterial part of the human being or animal, regarded as immortal. Now, there are several approaches we could take to this discussion. Here are some of them. Some people need to go no further than their own religious scripture and faith and revelations that they've grown up with. Other people put a lot of stock in what mediums say about the hereafter. And also, near-death experiences are just huge these days. I don't know if you realize this or not, but now there are 15 million Americans who claim to have had life-changing near-death experiences. This has mushroomed, this figure, because of the advances in cardiopulmonary resuscitation that goes on in our hospitals. And then there are people who claim to have memories of previous lives, and therefore they anticipate life after this one. This has been popularized by Ian Stevenson, who has investigated tens of thousands of kids who claim, usually before the age of 6 or 8, of having been somebody else in a previous life, which checks out on intensive investigation. And then there's what I just want to roundly talk about in terms of consciousness research. I think that we have evolved into an interesting transition in our talk about immortality. There are a lot of people who are saying this is too important to be left to religion and spiritual philosophizing. Immortality now affects life on earth. And this is how this works in the view of, again, Sogyal Rinpoche. I've come to realize that the disastrous effects of the denial of death go far beyond the individual. They affect the whole planet. Believing fundamentally that this life is the only one, modern people have developed no long-term vision. So, there's nothing to restrain them from plundering the planet for their own immediate ends and from living in a selfish way that could prove fatal for the future. Now, one of the stalwarts in modern psychiatry was Carl Jung, who made a huge point in his philosophy and his therapy with his patients of promoting immortality. The decisive question for man is this: Is he related to something infinite or not? That is the telling question of his life. He was so convinced of the importance of a belief in immortality and survival of bodily death that he made this a fundamental principle in his therapy with his patients. A man should be able to say he has done his best to form a conception of life after death or to create some image of it, even if he must confess his failure. Not to have done so is a vital loss. As a doctor, I make every effort to strengthen the belief in immortality. So this proposition, this premise that something survives, leads us to ask, well, what is it that survives? What actually is consciousness? I want to drop back, in case you need reminders of what our culture has said about this question, by sketching for you what modern science has come to say about the nature of consciousness. Now, as I've already implied, it's assumed by most neurologists, neurophysiologists, and neurobiologists that consciousness and the brain are pretty much the same thing, so that when one dies, nothing survives the death of the body. It's just not possible. So all talk is about any survival, any aspect of survival is just nonsense. A lot of famous people have taken this stand. Among them was Stephen Hawking, who died a couple of years ago. I regard the brain as a computer, which will stop working when its components fail. There's no heaven or afterlife for broken down computers. That's a fairy tale for people who are afraid of the dark. One of the people I followed in this debate is Marvin Minsky, who for many years ran the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at MIT. Actually, he's a funny guy. He has a tremendous sense of humor. He said, the brain is just a computer made out of meat. I don't know if this gives you a warm and fuzzy feeling or not, but we're not going to dwell on this. We're going to shift to someplace else. Karen Stoles now is a hotshot linguist in Australia. Thinking is just the meat talking to itself. It's generated by the brain, and when we die, unfortunately, that dies with us. And here, I love these presumptuous certain statements that get appended to these kind of statements. We can state that categorically. I mean, we're sure about this. There's no room for doubt. And so part of the conventional medicine science message is that there is absolutely no direction, purpose, or meaning to any of this. None. Here's what David Lindley, a famous current astrophysicist, said. We humans are just crumbs of organic matter clinging to the surface of one tiny rock. Cosmically, we are no more significant than mold on a shower curtain. And one of the most vocal, confident people writing currently is Daniel Dennett, who's a philosopher at Tufts University. When we consider whether free will is an illusion or reality, we're looking into an abyss. What seems to confront us is a plunge into nihilism and despair. And if this didn't make the point, he rounds this out with this. We're all zombies. Nobody is conscious. I would like for you to unpack this. If we're all zombies, so is Professor Dennett, right? And if nobody is conscious, then neither is he. So you begin to wonder, if he's an unconscious zombie, why on earth would we believe anything he says? If you want to look at a Nobel-headed computer scientist who really is coming to terms with these issues, I would recommend that you read any book by Bernardo Castro. His most recent book written for non-specialists is Materialism is Baloney. And it's sensational. And this is what he says about these comments by people of the persuasion of Dr. Dennett. Here we have consciousness trying to trick consciousness into believing that it doesn't exist. The motivation behind this train of thought, which is called eliminative materialism, is clear. If we deny the very existence of consciousness, presto, we no longer need to explain it. Galen Strawson, who is a philosopher at my old alma mater, University of Texas, this particular denial is the strangest thing that has ever happened in the whole history of human thought. So, conventional science, just let me summarize. Mind equals what the brain is doing. You are your body and absolutely nothing more. And when your body dies, all that is you dies with it and absolutely nothing survives. Well, there's another side to science, and if there were not, I wouldn't be here. Here's a website for you. A couple of years ago, several of us who were involved in these issues came together and started opensciences.org, and we have published a manifesto for a post-materialist science. And if you want some ammunition about eternality, immortality, survivability, and the fundamental nature of consciousness, you will find a lot of ammunition at this website. This website was a warm-up to this. The Academy for the Advancement of Post-Material Sciences, and about a couple dozen of us have gotten together and started something that continues the work of the previous website. And our motto, if we had to pick a motto, would be taken from the man who founded modern quantum physics, Max Planck. All matter exists only by virtue of a force, and we must assume behind this force the existence of consciousness and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter. Now, I want to suggest to you that all this talk about the transition to a non-local, eternal, infinite version of consciousness is not something that has been hatched up by a bunch of dope-smoking hippies in Southern California. This vision is rooted in some of the greatest scientific minds of the 20th century, only one of whom was Max Planck. And according to this way of thinking, this transition is that consciousness is absolutely fundamental. As Planck said, it is the matrix of all matter. It is beyond time, it is non-local with respect to space and time, and therefore is eternal, immortal, and unitary. Still, this gateway, although it has been opened by some of these great thinkers, is difficult to get through because of the prejudice that exists in the scientific community. So, a practical problem is, how in the world can we justify a belief in the non-local unitary immortality of consciousness in an age in which nearly everyone in authority denies its existence? The beginning point is to admit ignorance. Ignorance about the fundamental nature of consciousness. Stuart Kaufman, whom you all ought to have here to discuss some of these issues with you, says this: nobody has the faintest idea what consciousness is. I don't have any idea, nor does anybody else, including the philosophers of mind. One of my favorite authorities in this field is the cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman at UC Irvine. The scientific study of consciousness is in the embarrassing position of having no scientific theory of consciousness. These are the insiders who spend their entire professional lives looking at the behavior of consciousness. Freeman Dyson, one of the most famous physicists alive. The origin of life is a total mystery, and so is the existence of human consciousness. He goes on to say, we have no clear idea how the electrical discharges occurring and the nerve cells in our brains are connected with their feelings and desires and actions. Steven Pinker, who wrote a book with the presumptuous title, How the Mind Works, conceded this in terms of how consciousness could possibly arise from the brain. Beats the heck out of me. I have some prejudices, but I have no idea of how to begin to look for a defensible answer, and neither does anybody else. One of the most prestigious physicists alive working today is Henry Stepp at UC Berkeley. The new physics presents prima facie evidence that our human thoughts are linked to nature by non-local connections. What a person chooses to do in one region seems immediately to affect what is true somewhere else in the universe. Our thoughts do something. And Gerald Feinberg, if such paranormal phenomena indeed occur, things like telepathy, clairvoyance, and so on, no change in the fundamental equations of physics would be needed to describe them. Confirmatory opinion is by Costa de Beauregard, famous physicist. Far from being irrational, the paranormal is postulated by today's physics. He continues, today's physics allows for the existence of paranormal phenomena of telepathy, precognition, and psychokinesis. The whole concept of non-locality in contemporary physics requires this possibility. Now, looking back across the 20th century, here's what we've managed to do with respect to understanding the mind. We've pretty much taken it apart. And psychologists and psychiatrists today have become comfortable talking about the parts of consciousness, such as the conscious, the unconscious, the preconscious, the subconscious, the ego, id, superego, and so on. I want to suggest to you that we've been looking through the wrong end of the telescope. And it is possible, it is vital, that we begin to put the mind back together. That we honor not just its parts, but its unitary, collective aspects. And I've mentioned this term several times, the term non-local, quality of consciousness. Consciousness that is non-local is not localized. That is a way of saying it's not in a place. You can't confine consciousness to specific points in space, such as brains or bodies, and neither can you confine consciousness to specific points in time, such as the right now, the present. And so when you hear us use this term, non-local mind, when you see this term non-local, you can cross that out and substitute the term infinite. Non-local and infinite are pretty much interchangeable. So what does an infinite mind look like? Well, it's infinite. It doesn't have any boundaries, does it? Otherwise, it would not be infinite. It would be finite. So if something is infinite in space, it's everywhere in space, right? It's omnipresent. And if something is infinite in time, it's everywhere in time. It's eternal and immortal. I hope you can begin to see that non-local mind contains spiritual dynamite. It has a way of upending the assumptions about the finality of death. One reason why it's vital to entertain this view of consciousness as non-local is that consciousness can simply do things that local brains cannot do. So consciousness cannot be the same thing as the brain. Now, one person who began to write forcefully about this, although when he lived the term non-locality had not become popular, was, once again, Carl Jung, who talked about the collective unitary aspects of the mind. This vision of consciousness as being infinite has never been a secret to self-respecting poets. Yeats said, "The borders of our memories are shifting, and our memories are part of one great memory. The borders of our minds are ever shifting, and many minds can flow into one another and create or reveal a single mind of single energy." This is not just the airy invention of poets. Some of the most prestigious physicists in the 20th century have landed here, among whom was one of my great heroes in science, Erwin Schrödinger, who won a Nobel Prize in the 1930s. Consciousness is a singular entity. To divide or multiply consciousness is something absolutely meaningless. There is only one alternative, namely the unification of minds or consciousness. The overall number of minds is just one. In truth, there is only one mind. This was taken up by successors to some of these great founding fathers of modern physics, among whom was David Bohm, who died just a few years back. If we don't establish these absolute boundaries between minds, then it's possible they could unite as one mind. Deep down, the consciousness of mankind is one. This is a virtual certainty, and if we don't see this, it's because we're blinding ourselves to it. I take pride as an American citizen that the greatest essayist in the century following the founding of this republic was Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Emerson nailed it. There is one mind common to all individual men, a universal mind. He called this the oversoul. The oversoul is that unity within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other minds. Within man is the soul of the whole, the eternal one. There's a great book out about this. Well, I'll let you contemplate this book cover. We're looking at new science here, where we break with the materialism of the past and we say that consciousness is not the equivalent of the brain. We say now, I think, that consciousness works through the brain, but it isn't produced by the brain, and it cannot be completely explained by the brain, if so many of these scholars and experts have attested. So I think the metaphor that will carry the day is where we say that the brain, for some strange reason, happens to adore, it loves consciousness, and it transmits it. But it doesn't make it. And you could multiply this list of great intellects in the past 3 centuries in the Western world ad infinitum. These people are generally shouted down by the confidence of the overconfidence of the materialists who pretty much dominate the conversation. But an alternate view of how to feature or visualize the brain-mind relationship is with a prism. We know that light entering a prism is diffracted into the colors of the spectrum, but the prism doesn't manufacture the light that enters it. In the same way, the brain may modify and shift and even distort consciousness as it filters it, but it doesn't produce consciousness. David Darling, the astrophysicist, in his book Soul Search said, "We are conscious not because of the brain, but really in spite of it." So, to reiterate Planck again, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. Now, this is sort of a natural breaking point in my talk, and from here on out, I'm going to talk about what these non-local events look like, how they manifest in their lives, and what they have to do with healing.